Hi, I am Tony Russo, and this is The Rest, your weekly rundown of news from around death care. This week, our show is preempted by another show. There was some important news about the way that death doulas can and cannot operate in Indiana, and it has a real effect on how we can and maybe should start thinking about the licensure process. And there's all sorts of issues, and they're all complex. So I was fortunate enough to get Tanya Marsh, who's a professor of law at Wake Forest and also a practicing attorney in Indiana. So she's the expert, and I am going to go through and talk about some of my reporting. She's going to talk about the law, and hopefully at the end we have a better sense of what's going on in Indiana. So I'll publish the other stories, but there's no podcast for them this week. Instead, here's Tanya. So I want to welcome Tanya Marsh to what's a special edition. We'll call this the special death doula edition of The Rest, which is my usual weekly news update. So first of all, welcome, and thank you for taking the time on short notice.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you talking to me about it.
So back, I think maybe it was 4 years ago now that I'm thinking of it, because it happened a while ago. I developed a new pen palship with the Institute for Justice, because this is a pro bono organization that ends up defending a lot of funeral personnel who run up against weird laws. So there was a death doula case in California that they had been working on, and I reported on that. And then after that, it was like, this guy's not allowed to sell coffins. This guy. So I started getting pretty much everyone. But the one that really kind of caught my eye, and I think for good reason, was the Lauren Richwine case, which was mostly resolved recently. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I took away from it, and Tanya's going to interrupt me because she's smarter and fresher on the case. So for the parts that I leave out, but Lauren Richwine is a death doula in Indiana, and the Indiana laws surrounding being a funeral director are very, very, very specific and broad. I don't know how anything specific and broad, but if you're not a funeral director, you can't even think about this. And when I first started reporting on the story, it seemed like it wasn't right. And I'm going to ask you to come in and help me here, because when I saw it, it looked to me like it said no one in the entire state is allowed to talk about what happens physically and financially after you die, except a licensed funeral director. Is that right? Is that way off base?
I think that's a pretty fair characterization. So let me just say, so Indiana, like most states, defines a term called like the practice of funeral service, and then they prohibit anyone who isn't a licensed funeral director from engaging in any of the activities that make up that definition. So the definition in Indiana is a little different than that in many states. It has the things that you would expect, like the delivery of funeral services, but it's the second clause of the definition that really comes into play in this case. The counseling of individuals concerning the methods and alternatives for the final disposition of human remains.
And that was the one that I'm like, do they not have like commercials? Like, do you have to have like a funeral director to do it? Because if you see one of these national SCI dignity ads, right? So they run these dignity ads about, this is one of the ways that that should be illegal in Indiana, right?
So as you know, Tony, but the audience probably doesn't know.
Yes, I forgot.
I teach law at Wake Forest Law School in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, so I spend a lot of time in North Carolina, but I'm from Indianapolis. I am an Indiana licensed lawyer. I've been practicing law in Indiana for 26 years. And as I do a lot with funeral and cemetery law, I give a lot of presentations, including in Indiana. And what's really ironic is I have given a number of presentations in Indianapolis to individuals concerning methods and alternatives for the final disposition of human remains. I'm talking about what the law says in Indiana to individual people in a public setting, and that's exactly what they went after Lauren Richwine for.
there are two kind of things at issue, both nationally and specifically in Indiana, which is, and we got to talk about this a little bit before we started, which is that there are old laws that just haven't caught up with the times, and oftentimes there's not a good reason to change them or the will to change them. I was saying I used to cover the beer industry, and there were still prohibition laws on the books that they couldn't practically enforce. And didn't have really the will to repeal, so they were just like, "All right, well, we'll just pretend that's not a law for a little while." But you said that that's not uncommon.
Well, it's not uncommon to have laws on the books that are not being enforced, and I could give you any number of examples. I teach funeral and cemetery law at Wake, and I tell my students on the first day, I mean, I don't want to pick I don't want to pick on funeral and cemetery law like in particular, but it's the area of the law that I'm
You're the
probably
expert. Yeah.
well, I'm more familiar with that, like, in every state than I am with any other kind of little sub body of law, but
Mhm.
I'll tell you these statutes in general are a mess, and they're a mess in part because of the incremental changes that have been introduced over time, right? Like when cremation was put in place or now with alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction being put in place. There's been little incremental changes and they haven't gone back and like changed other things, right? So that's part of the problem. It's also not at all uncommon for a state legislature to leave a clearly unconstitutional law in place in hopes that perhaps the environment will change one day in the future and that law will kind of pop back into being. Like, for example, in North Carolina, the law legalizing marriage says only a man and a woman can be married. That's unconstitutional under very clear precedent from the United States Supreme Court. But I think the North Carolina legislature leaves it in place so that if that precedent ever gets overturned in the court, then they've got marriage between a man and a woman back, right?
And along those lines, if they felt like they had the right fight, because I know that constitutional law unfortunately works that way. If they felt they had the right fight, they might just arrest someone and say, "All right, let's play this up to the Supreme Court until it's settled."
Right. Yeah.
That's how the overturning things happens, right?
Right. I mean, in the funeral and cemetery law context, again, you've got this whole body of laws that exist in a lot of states that I sort of put on under the umbrella of abuse of corpse, right? There's
Yeah.
criminal penalties attached to certain treatment of human remains. And frankly, the way that some of those are written, I think it's completely unconstitutional because they're too vague. Because they say you can't treat human remains in a way that violates community standards or some language like, well, what the heck does that mean? Right? Like if somebody gets mad at me, I can't do that. But those laws are so rarely enforced that we have very little guidance about what it actually means, right? But that doesn't mean a prosecutor can't pop up one day. So I'll give you another example. Under the abuse of corpse statutes, the bodies exhibit, that traveling bodies exhibit,
Right.
many county prosecutors in this country could have filed criminal charges against the people who put the bodies exhibit together and have traveled it around. It has been in states where you clearly have an abuse of corpse statute that says you can't do some of the things that they did to the remains. But those laws just, people don't pay attention to them. They're not that enforced. Who's paying attention to the definition of practice of funeral service in Indiana besides funeral directors? Nobody, right? So
Right.
it's not getting anybody's attention.
I did a story last year, I think, on a funeral director from New York who was bringing a body to be cremated. I'm going to pretend it's Pennsylvania. It's like a 6-hour drive or something.
Mhm.
And on the way, the family said, could we have one last goodbye? And he didn't have any place to do it. So he literally stopped at a park, rolled out the casket, opened up the top, and they had an impromptu. He's like, yeah, that was totally against the law, but I figured I'd get it over with before the police, and that was exactly what happened. The police showed up to see why people were complaining about a body in the park, and he was already gone on to the crematory. But the notion that nobody wants to have a fight about whether or not you can have a quick goodbye in the park. They just don't want quick goodbyes in the park every Sunday.
Right.
But this is a different law, and I'm going to say out loud that I think that this was one of the things that we were just talking about. They're like, all right, Lauren Richwine is the person that we're going to prosecute, and chase death doulas out of Indiana. And they deny, I've asked that question before, they've denied it, but the evidence doesn't support for me that case, because what happened is they had their eye on her, and she brought a family to a cemetery, and the cemeterian complained that she was helping them bury a body without permission, even though they had all the right paperwork. There wasn't a funeral director in the car at the time. And that was what sparked the entire case. And Indiana felt they had a fantastic chance of making it officially on the books that it was illegal to be a death doula, because they were violating the same laws that you violate when you give presentation. And then they missed. They asked for a summary judgment on the first day, and they're like, okay, well, you lose. How's that for a summary judgment?
Right.
And so can you kind of take me through that process there, where they made the complaint and then it was dismissed? Well, not dismissed. It was cleared, and then they decided to keep up with the fight.
Sure. So let me just run through real quick kind of what
Please.
I would call the procedural history of this case. So I think it was in 2021 that this complaint was made to the Indiana Professional Licensing Agency that said that Richwine, I guess, and I didn't know the facts of the complaint, but was seen in a cemetery trying to bury a body without a funeral director present. And so then the matter is referred to the Indiana Attorney General's office, and they did an investigation. What the Indiana AG's office did then was go for a cease and desist order against Richwine. So they did their investigation. They conclude she was violating the statute, and they can do that administratively. So they don't have to go to court in order to get a cease and desist order. It is, I would say, in terms of government enforcement, it's like a cheap and easy way to try and stop somebody from doing something that you think is violating the law, right? It's an attorney's time, but it's an internal attorney's time, right? They're not
He's already on the clock.
He's already on the clock. They're not writing a check. So it doesn't cost the state very much to try and do a cease and desist order. And I would say if you're trying to enforce a regulatory law like this, it wouldn't be unusual to sort of shoot a bunch of them out, and you're not going to necessarily win them all. But that's, of course, not where they stopped. I will say, though, that the cease and desist order identified a broad number of things that they said that Richwine was allegedly doing that constitute the practice of funeral service, including, they said, discussing funeral options with clients. The second one as a lawyer, is my personal favorite, assisting with paperwork such as living wills. I love that they think that preparing legal documentation is within the realm of funeral directors and not lawyers, right? So
And exclusively,
let's have a turf battle over what funeral directors are doing that lawyers ought to be doing. Providing verbal guidance with loved ones under the direct supervision of a licensed funeral director for moving, bathing, and dressing. Consulting with families about music selections, religious acknowledgments, and funeral programming. That they said that can only be done by licensed funeral directors. Accompanying families to funeral homes. You can't even go with them to a funeral home. And support with selection of goods and services, and reviewing a funeral home's general price list. So, this was a broad cease and desist order. Then what happened was Richwine went and hired an attorney when she got this notice from the state, and they negotiated with the AG's office a cease and desist letter. Once they had that final cease and desist letter issued by the state, Richwine then went to the federal court to argue that it was unconstitutional. This was probably about the point where the Institute for Justice got involved. So Richwine filed a lawsuit against the state saying you can't enforce this statute against me because this statute, and specifically that part I mentioned before about counseling of individuals concerning methods and alternatives for final disposition, that is unconstitutional. That's a violation of her First Amendment rights. And so in the lawsuit that Richwine filed against the state of Indiana, she asked for what's called a preliminary injunction. And a preliminary injunction is a court ordering the state, in this case, to not enforce the law against Richwine while the case is pending. In other words, while the courts are trying to figure out whether she's right or not, she's saying, leave the status quo that the state can't shut me down. Because that's a huge advantage for the state, right?
Yeah,
If they
starving.
can enforce that cease and desist order during the pendency of the case, she can't work.
And I spoke with her. She actually didn't work anyway, but wanted the opportunity. She just changed professions for 2 years. I pulled up my notes and then I hid them from myself. She was not a nurse, but she was working in kind of like a hospice-y type space,
Mm,
if I recall,
mhm.
for those 3 years.
So the district court, that first level trial court, they agreed with Richwine and said, yes, you can have a preliminary injunction. And the test for whether or not you can get a preliminary injunction is basically, are you more likely than not to succeed on the merits of the claim? So by giving her a preliminary injunction, the district court was already signaling to the state, we think she's right and you're wrong. We haven't made our final decision yet, but while we're thinking about it, we're going to let her continue to practice. The state disagreed and appealed that preliminary injunction to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals minced no words in upholding the preliminary injunction. And they made it very clear that even though the state has legitimate interests in protecting the public, consumer protection, protecting health and safety, preventing the spread of infectious disease, like those are all good reasons to regulate funeral services. But they said that none of those applied or justified the infringement of anyone's First Amendment rights in terms of that definition of the practice of funeral service. And let me read what the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals said, because courts don't often
It was yeah, please.
talk like this. The court said, this approach, that is the limitation on people's rights to counsel, this approach furthers the state's interests the way an atom bomb would further the eradication of a residential ant infestation. It goes much too far. We do not see how preventing the plaintiffs from telling a client about his or her options for the final disposition of their loved one's remains furthers the state's professed interests. So,
That was yeah.
fairly
Um,
clear.
One of the things that I argued at the time was it just makes them look bad. Now, when there's no business in the world where they're like, "All right, well, we'll sell something to you, but you can't ask anybody about what we're selling you." Who
Oh,
would do business with that company?
well, I think the funeral industry in general has legitimate reasons to be a bit protective and defensive, right? Because
Yes. No, absolutely.
I think the industry in whole has been treated poorly by people who do not understand what is going on. But I have said before, and I will continue to say, I don't exactly sort of in the spirit of what you just said. I don't think the knee-jerk response that many folks in the industry have to just hiding it more helps, right?
Right. That's exactly my point. My point is that I've been fortunate enough. I mean, I've reported on people who were bad actors and went to jail, but in my interactions, I haven't met anyone that's weird or sleazy or anything. Like everyone that I've ever spoken to that's a professional funeral director is just so focused on making sure that they're doing a good job. And then they want to pretend like, "Oh, I can't tell you what I do." Because otherwise you won't do business with me. It's just such a weird split in like the experience of a funeral director versus the laws that the funeral industry seems to defend. That's been a disconnect that I've always had trouble with since I started covering.
Well, I think the funeral industry is different from many other industries because funeral directors are both selling goods and services and they're providing counsel, comfort, advice, right?
Right.
Uh, about something that is very, American society is very death ignorant. I think we could know more, but we, sort of choose not to, right? So it's not like, I mean, yes, the industry sort of hides a lot of things because they think we can't handle it, but then also we've signaled really strongly we can't handle
We
it,
don't care. Yeah.
right? So I think it's that dual role of like counselor and, professional, like I'm going to help you grieve. And by the way, isn't this a lovely casket, right? It's
Right.
it's almost a fundamental conflict between those two roles, and that conflict makes people really suspicious, right? Like you think about like, financial advisors. And a couple decades ago, they got, and maybe some of them still do, got a percentage of whatever deal they sold you. And understandably, people were suspicious of what recommendations are you making to me for a stock or a mutual fund, because I know if you sell me something more, right, you're getting a cut. And so folks started moving over to like these advisors that you're paying a fixed fee to, because then they can give you unvarnished advice. The funeral industry has not done that.
Right. I'm sorry, you rang my bell on that. That was made illegal and legal over the course of, I think, 2 years. I think that was one of the first Trump presidency, because
Uh,
that's what I was still covering at the time. That was
uh,
one of the first things that they struck down, that you couldn't, because one of the things they were doing is they were just charging a fee and selling it to one of their own companies
right, right.
until until old people were out of money for because of fees.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was struck down and brought back, and I'm sorry to detour, but that was
Yeah.
I remember covering that pretty pretty
But
specifically.
that's so I mean, it's understandable why I think the public is suspicious of folks that they think have a fundamental financial conflict of interest. And funeral directors don't want to hear it, because I think you are right that almost every funeral director I've ever talked to legitimately, honestly believes that they are giving people advice, the best advice that they know how to give, right? They don't see themselves as having a fundamental conflict of interest. There's a disconnect between how folks in the industry view themselves and how the public views themselves. But the problem is not made better by
Right.
enforcing laws like this.
Yeah. Just to get back to it, because that's the other thing that I've been misreporting, and that's one of the reasons that we're talking, because I thought that this was kind of like the all clear. That
Right,
now, and I also thought that they were going to have to rewrite the law to make it less broad, but that is
right.
not the case. You are still right now. Are you in Indiana as we're speaking?
I am.
They could come crashing through your windows at this second and throw the cuffs on you, as I understand
Well, it's a Class B misdemeanor, but yeah,
it.
that would be a little dramatic for a Class B misdemeanor. But I guess theoretically, they can storm in the next time I give a presentation to the Indianapolis Bar Association and make me stop talking about green burial. Um,
Because she's the only one that's allowed to do it now. I mean, she's the only one that this applies to.
that's correct. So again, Richwine is the one who brought the federal case against the state in challenging the statute. And the challenge that they brought is what we call an as-applied challenge. So an as-applied challenge to a law says we're not arguing that the law is broadly unconstitutional, like fundamentally unconstitutional. We're saying it is unconstitutional as applied to me in this circumstance, right? So,
Right. Now,
um,
in my original reporting, I thought that meant as applied to death doulas, but it
right.
means literally as applied to Lauren Richwine.
It means as applied to the plaintiffs. This was not a class action lawsuit on behalf of all death doulas. This was a lawsuit brought by an individual and her company. So Lauren Richwine and Death Done
Right.
Differently, I think LLC. So when that's all you ask a court for, that's all the relief you're asking for from a court can't grant you more relief than you're asking for.
Right.
Right.
And so what happens now? So my concern after talking with you about it is that this still would have some sort of chilling effect, because they could send out 250, I don't think there are 250 death doulas. There are a limited number of death doulas in
Right.
Indiana for for obvious reasons, but they
Right.
could send all of them a cease and desist tomorrow, and that would be legal.
Um, I don't wanna say it would be legal. I
All
would
right.
say I would say it is not prohibited by the court.
There
So
you go.
so the last I'm
I
sorry,
forgot who I was talking to. Sorry about that.
I can't not be a lawyer, Tony, in this conversation. The final step in this whole procedural history process of this case is that after the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals made its decision upholding the preliminary injunction, the state sort of signaled they were going to keep fighting it and go back to the district court to keep trying to convince the district court that they were right in their interpretation of the law. However, just on June 9th, the parties all entered into what we call a consent decree, which means basically a settlement. So we're all agreeing on the following things, and at court, you don't have to make a decision. And what the state agreed to with Richwine was basically to drop it against her. And they said, we'll allow the preliminary injunction to become a permanent injunction, which means the state can't go after Lauren Richwine. They also ended up giving her attorneys fees. I think it ended up costing them $250,000, which isn't bad. But I'm sure it was a substantial amount of legal work, frankly.
Oh yeah, no, they've been at this for years, and this is their thing too. Like that's how they get paid, is by they're almost like those guys on the billboards. They get paid if you win.
That's right. That's right.
No offense intended to anybody, billboards or the Institute of Justice.
Right. So you're right. This only applies to Lauren Richwine. And theoretically, tomorrow, the state of Indiana could send out cease and desist letters, and maybe they already have, and we haven't heard about it, to other death doulas and to lawyers and to, religious advisors and to, your aunt who's who's telling people about green burial. Theoretically, all of those people could get cease and desist letters because the underlying statute remains in force. However, you still have these decisions by a federal district court and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that say that this law is like an atom bomb for a residential ant infestation, right? That's the important part. That's the important part, because anybody who gets hit with a cease and desist letter can walk into court and say, Your Honor, the Seventh Circuit has already told us what they think about this law. That's not binding precedent. It doesn't have any impact on the statute itself and whether or not the statute is constitutional, but make me take this up to the Seventh Circuit. I think we know what the Seventh Circuit is going to say, right? So it's kind of a waste of time for the state to go after anybody else under the statute, but the statute stays in place. Now, the only caveat I would make is, individual cases that go to court are about the application of law to a particular set of facts. And the reality is with death doulas that not every death doula is engaging in the same activities, and they're not advertising their services in the same way. Both the district court and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals made a big deal about the language on Lauren Richwine's website. That is that she made it crystal clear that you have to hire a funeral director. And so both courts said, state, she's not saying she replaces a funeral director. She expressly says you have to hire a funeral director. But I've looked at death doula websites. Not every death doula website says you have to hire a funeral director, right? So that's one little fact that could turn how the court looks at the application of the law to a different situation.
And so this is interesting only because I've been around the death doula space. I would need to be another person to do the kind of coverage that it deserves. But I still try to stay a little bit in touch. If this was, for instance, the NFDA, everybody would have an email this morning saying, go on your website and say, you need to hire a funeral director.
Right.
But that's not something that the Indiana funeral, there's an ELDA and NELDA, I guess, but there's not a kind of central clearinghouse for all this information, which is the other reason that it's difficult for people to accept doulas and also for doulas to kind of get an organizational thing. I mean, this isn't an organized profession. That's beyond dispute. I mean, you can do it with a business card, and that I understand how that makes people nervous. But that's where funeral service was 120 years ago.
That's right. I mean, so it's interesting because Institute for Justice, one of the main things that they try and do, they're a public interest law firm, and one of their main purposes is to challenge what they view as overly restrictive, occupational licensing laws, right? And all these laws that say you can't be a funeral director, you can't engage in the practice of funeral service unless you're licensed. That's occupational licensing, right?
Hmm.
Funeral directors are the ones who ask to be licensed in the first place. And they did it to make themselves a more recognized and respected profession. This is the period of time when embalming is becoming more important. And it became central to the identity of people who were undertakers, right? They're making caskets and providing transportation to the cemetery. If all you're doing is making a casket and providing the transportation to the cemetery, you're not a professional. Embalming was the technology that allowed undertakers to transform themselves into the professionals that we now know of as funeral directors. And part of that transition was this occupational licensing regime, which doctors have and lawyers have and lots of people have, right, who are
Hmm.
quote unquote professionals. So, but it's a double-edged sword. It provides a lot of benefits. It protects you, but then you have to run through a lot of traps to get into it. And I think it is of rising tension within the doula community about, is this the future that we want, right? Do we
Right.
want to continue to work outside of this system entirely, or should doulas have common certification? Should they have educational requirements? Should there be some kind of license or certification from the state? Because, yeah, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that. It would, raise the barriers to entry into the profession. But right now, they can't get reimbursed by insurance, right? I
Right.
mean, so
No,
there would
I've heard that. I've heard that from for a lot. Yes.
but one of the major benefits too would be the practice of funeral service statute is being used as a tool against doulas, but it's also a protective umbrella for people who are engaged in the practice of funeral service and licensed funeral directors, right? So
Hmm.
if you had an analog, this is the practice of death doulaing, right?
Right. You could fight it out or hash it out.
You'd have more clarity. You would be able to operate in safety, right? And to your point, without that kind of overarching structure, they're operating in a gray area every day.
And that's a hiccup that isn't going away.
It would take a lot. It would take a lot, but also I think doulas themselves are very divided
Yeah.
on whether that kind of legal structure is a positive or a negative.
And since they don't have anything super, super technical that is, they don't embalm, so they don't have a good reason to get a like a public health exception or anything like that
A public health exception to the
to the work
license.
that they do. Yeah, their work doesn't really affect. They're not going to spread plague by doing their work wrong, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Right. Well, I mean, again, back to what I said, not every doula does exactly the same things, right?
Right.
I think that the core of what doulas do, I mean, like, again, as an attorney, I'm a little concerned when I see doulas or funeral directors, right? Or anyone helping people prepare estate planning documents, healthcare powers of attorney, right? I mean,
Yeah.
those are legal documents. And I know there are folks who are not lawyers who are doing that work. And that makes me a little nervous, frankly, right? Because I know all the ways that can go wrong. So I think doulas are offering counseling services, but they're not licensed counselors.
Right.
Maybe, right? Maybe they're going over the line into what funeral directors think is their turf. Maybe they're going over the line into what lawyers think is their turf. I am sure there is a space that they can occupy that provides a value add to society, right? And to their
Mm.
clients, but they are just in a dangerous space because they are occupying a space that none of the others were covering, right? But
But fall under it.
there's just some inevitable turf wars.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of excellent points, we are kind of running up against it. Is there anything that you didn't get to?
No, I just hope the Institute for Justice defends me if, following this podcast, the state of Indiana breaks down my door for my Class B misdemeanor. Alleged Class B misdemeanor.
Fair enough. But I do want to ask two quick follow-up things. I was privileged to see something that you had written on this, but you sent it to me in an email. Is that someplace people can find it? Can I put that link in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an article I wrote for Talk Death. I'll send you the link and you can put it in.
Very cool. And of course, your podcast, Death at Sec, you just had my favorite death doula on, which was really, really cool to hear. Jane Callahan. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
That was a great conversation. I love her. So she and I are both on the board of the Funeral Consumers Alliance of North Carolina.
I did not know that. I reviewed her book. I read her book. I've never read anything that well done. Like, it should be required reading. I think if everybody had to read it, there would be more death doulas and death doulas would be taken more seriously, but also people would take their death more seriously. I think that she just hit a home run with that.
It's a beautiful book for sure.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, right. Tony, you need to be on my podcast next, so let's get that set up.
Very well. But for now, let's sign off, and I'll talk to you again. You're now officially my lawyer correspondent. Congratulations.
All right, cool.
Thanks, as always, to my paid subscribers who support all the work I do. And if you're interested in becoming a subscriber of any sort, we have different levels, including the level that is free. You can go to ondeathcare.com and sign up. All of the posts are free. There are some bonuses that paid subscribers get, and you can look at that if it's something that interests you. The rest has been an On Death Care production. It was written and edited and all the fun stuff by me, Tony Russo. Thank you for joining us. And if you've not subscribed yet to the podcast, that would be a cool thing to have you do as well. I know there are lots of ways to spend your spare time, and the fact that you guys take the time to listen to this is always flattering. And I try to earn your attention every week, and I'm going to try again this week. But until next time, this has been Tony Russo for On Death Care.